Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Political Vigilante. My name is Graham Elwood. We are joined by journalist, repeat guest. We love having you on the show. Whitney Webb is here. First of all, Happy New Year. And
yay!
So much to be excited about in 2021. We start the year off with neo-Nazis having a furry convention in the Capitol. So that was exciting. So we're going to talk about a bunch of things in this interview, not the least of which is Jean-Luc Brunel and Nygaard have been arrested since we spoke last. But I want to talk to you first and foremost about your perceptions. I mean, you obviously cover a lot about what happened at the Capitol January 6th. And, you know, how you see this sort of playing out as somebody that's covered a lot about the surveillance state and because we're in this very precarious spot. What happened was awful. There needs to be, repercussions for the people that broke into the Capitol building, some of whom have had automatic weapons and handcuffs and were wearing neo-Nazi paraphernalia. But then there's also the other part of me is very scared that like, oh, great. Now we're just going to use this for Patriot Act 2.0 and taking away more of our personal freedoms and censorship. And like, they're just green lighting all of this stuff. So how did what were your first thoughts when you watched the Capitol siege last week? And what do you see now as we're almost, we're 6 days away from it. How do you see this?
Well, I have a lot to say, but I think it's easiest for me anyway to explain how I interpret what happened last week by going a bit back in time. To the end of 2019, which is when I first started researching and talking about the 2020 election, because I noticed that there were a lot of national security officials and also front companies for both U.S. and Israeli intelligence that were talking about the 2020 election, how it was going to essentially be an event, not a normal election. It was going to be an event that would completely erode Americans' faith in the democratic system and would essentially be the last, real, in a sense, and by real, I mean like previous elections, that this one was going to be different and that it was going to basically fracture the American electorate and totally undermine the majority of Americans' faith in the democratic system, right? So this was back in 2019.
I want to just jump in real quick because now I remember we had you on the show late summer, early fall, and you mentioned this very thing, that they were the intelligence community was going to use this election to split America and make us, it was like by design. So, and me personally, I thought it was going to happen more around the actual November election.
Well, me too, but we didn't really know, right? And a lot of the simulations that came after that initial stuff at the end of 2019, like the Transition Integrity Project being one example, started talking about not just the election, but sort of as this whole period, these what they called the Transition Integrity Project, called a dark 11 weeks between Election Day and Inauguration Day, right? And so what do you know? There's an event in that very period, and we're told that there's also going to be, at least now, an event on Inauguration Day. But anyway, in this timeline I'm talking about from 2019, there's something that very interesting that happened in March of last year that got no coverage at all, because that was also when the COVID-19 crisis really hit globally. So people were obviously paying attention to that and not to congressional hearings. At this congressional hearing in March, the U.S. National Security State, the FBI and DHS specifically, announced that there was going to be a pivot to domestic terrorism. And the FBI, Joint Terrorism Task Force and other parts of the FBI that have been involved in the entrapment of Muslim Americans and the creation of these fake terror plots that they then go and foil, at the last minute, and then they use it to justify the increase of their budgets and things like that. I'm sure your viewers probably know that to an extent. Mm-hmm. They said that they were going to pivot their focus from Muslim Americans to people, white Americans on sort of the far right fringe, or what have you, in an attempt to basically prevent, use the same tactics where basically they create what they call individualized threat assessment profiles or threat profiles of people that they suspect are going to commit some sort of event, and then they go and they harass them, they harass their families, they harass their contacts. And in the past, when this was going on with Muslim Americans, there were cases that would come out where some of these people, because of that extreme pressure from the feds, they were already in a precarious position. They would end up snapping, or in some cases, they would get entrapped in plots where the leaders of those plots ended up being FBI ringleaders. And not long after this pivot happened, we had things with the plot to kidnap Governor Whitmer, where it turns out the ringleader of that plot was an FBI informant that was paid almost $30,000 to set up that whole thing. And that is very disconcerting, right? So at the same hearing, though, we have this lady named Elizabeth Newman from DHS, and she says that there is going to be another 9/11 style event of domestic terror, that it's not going to be bad in terms of numbers killed or maybe the visuals, and that we can see it building and we can't quite stop it, which is very interesting also. So, and since then, after that hearing in March, we had numerous people, many of the same people that were saying in 2019 that the 2020 election was going to play out that way, that they were saying we need a new domestic terror law, we need new domestic terrorism law statutes and things like that, right? So this is all before the 2020 election even takes place. So as far as what happened last week, I have a lot of questions and I have a lot of concerns. So so when we look at the different video feeds of how those people got into the Capitol, there's a huge discrepancy between those that have been promoted by mainstream media and those that have come out on Twitter. And a lot of and other, from people that were there, that were independent media and other things like that, people who were covering it. We now have video of not only from one side, the cops letting them in through the security fence, but also opening the doors to the Capitol. And so, but what mainstream media shows they don't show those pictures. What they show instead is the one part where they broke glass in a window and then jumped through the window, implying that there was no assistance from authorities. And so that's why I tend to not agree with characterization of this as a coup attempt, because in what kind of coup attempt do the authorities protecting the building allow those people to come inside? I mean, that honestly doesn't make any sense. And so there's a couple ways to interpret that law enforcement response that I've seen anyway. One is that people are saying this means law enforcement is infiltrated by QAnon and white supremacists, or that this was allowed to happen coming from the top of the national security state. The people that were responsible for this decision were at the top of DC Capitol Police, and so it becomes important to look at the connections of those people. And so the top guy at the head of DC Capitol Police, doesn't really have affiliations that I've seen anyway with Trumpers or QAnon or white supremacist groups. Instead, he used to work for a company called Nobliss, and the chairman of the board is the former head of DHS, Michael Chertoff, who was also part of the Transition Integrity Project and one of the key people talking about the election chaos scenario, and a major beneficiary if there is a war on domestic terror launched, as well as former heads of different U.S. intelligence agencies, of which there is now 18, because Space Force was just added to the intelligence community. So for those that think that that's just a fun new branch of the military and Star Trek, here we come. Now it's a pal of the CIA. So,
but Stephen Carell is a funny sitcom on Netflix, so it can't be that bad, right?
Oh my God. I mean, yeah, pretty surreal, right? But yeah. I tend to think that this isn't an issue necessarily. So yeah, there is an issue in many parts around the country where there are cops that are definitely sympathetic to these far-right elements. But we also have to keep in mind a lot of these far-right groups for a long time have been infiltrated also by the U.S. government, by the FBI. And, they announced essentially publicly at this congressional hearing that they were going to use this to manufacture consent for this war on domestic terror. And what we see now in the wake of this event last Wednesday are attempts to manufacture consent for that war on domestic terror, focusing specifically on manufacturing consent for that among the left in the United States, specifically wanting progressives and leftists to sign on and cheer this on, when what's key here is that we consider the history of the national security state. When they get these powers, who do they target? Do they go after the right, or do they go after the left and environmental activists and progressives and social movements and things like that? I encourage you to look at the history of what these people do when they get that type of power. I mean, just look at the Dakota pipeline, for example, and how that was handled in comparison to last Wednesday and things like that. I don't think it's just an issue of incompetence or the cops liking people on the right. I think this is a very specific thing here. And I think it's very interesting, too, that we're seeing people from the squad specifically being pushed out in front and leading this response, because I really think they want progressives to rubber stamp this war on progressive terror, or sorry, on domestic terror, and that they're going to flip this around at some point and use Antifa as a boogeyman. And then the people on the right that feel under pressure right now will be like, yeah, those are the real terrorists, just like they were doing last year. And I think it's notable, too, we have to keep in mind that this war on domestic terror, the foundations for it, have been set up by both parties. And if you look at the executive orders that Trump put out last year, using the BLM protests as justification, that executive order is now being used to charge people that were at the Capitol for sentences much greater than they would have normally received. And that was supposed to be to protect these monuments and other stuff like that, which at the end of the day mean that if progressives want to get together and do a sit-in, for example, of a federally owned building, or they want to do anything really on federal property, the justification being, the narrative being set up now after Wednesday and the type of laws they want to pass can essentially criminalize that activity. And a lot of these domestic terror laws written by Democrats were called out when they tried to pass them previously by the ACLU, not only saying that they would criminalize essentially all dissent from the government, and this is the ACLU saying this, right, that they'll be used to target minorities and mainly progressive activists. So progressives rubber stamp and approve this type of legislation at their own risk, because historically this has been used to go after leftists. I mean, if you look at the coup attempts done by the U.S. abroad, what type of governments do they traditionally target? Right. And it's no coincidence that the people that set up DHS a lot of them were former CIA officials involved in things like Vietnam's Phoenix program, which later became the roadmap for Operation Condor in Latin America, which was used to go after leftist, socialist, communist, every variety of people on the left, and killed over 100,000 people. Many more disappeared, right? And, I mean, I think if you look at the history, it's pretty obvious who the national security state is really interested in targeting with these types of laws. And I think it's very interesting that we're seeing this focus on getting progressives specifically to sign off on this.
Yeah, it is interesting. They really, it's that's the thing that I feel so torn, because as a comedian that's driven around this country for the better part of 30 years, gone into small towns, I know how that, militia racist element is, and they can be pretty scary. And they're in a country where they can go buy AR-15s and do whatever they want. And of course, there's no doubt that the intelligence community has infiltrated them, just like they've infiltrated everything. BLM.
Well, right. Absolutely.
And
those people exist too, but I also don't want people, I think it's dangerous to paint all Trump supporters now, or all people that were at that rally and not necessarily in the Capitol, with this broad brush, calling them all insurrectionists, domestic terrorists. And especially if you consider the fact that these people were let into the Capitol, I'm sure there's instances where they chose to let specific people in the Capitol because they wanted them there. You look at, for example, the people that broke into Nancy Pelosi's office. You have prominent MAGA personalities like Nick Fuentes of the America First show or whatever. And you also have Baked Alaska, who's also like a famous alt-right personality. And they were allowed to stream in there. I mean, if this was really a domestic terror attack when the police used cell phone jammers or something like they used against other people that were streaming outside the Capitol, including like progressive outlets like Status Quo and stuff like that, and people that were there covering it for T-Lab who had their streams cut by the police, but those people were allowed to stream from within Pelosi's office. I think they wanted that there was an interest in getting, certain photographs and certain sort of creating a media spectacle that they could use to manufacture consent for this in some way. I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that is really suspect about this. And I think there's an effort to sort of drive us into a place of responding to this event just based on pure emotion instead of the facts of the event, not unlike they did after 9/11, to try and get us to consent to things that are not in our interest as a country.
That's a great point, because I'm watching the reaction, especially from the left and so-called progressives, who are now just totally okay with, I mean, like, to just say, okay, these white nationalist organizations are domestic terror groups. Yeah, I would agree with that. Sure, they're terrorizing people. But then when you look at what that will be used for, it'll be used to censor, it'll be used to round up. And now, as you say, like on Sunday for the Force the Vote, there wasn't that many people. But what if 100,000 people would have just peacefully gone to the Capitol building and sat there and said, we're not leaving. You can arrest us. We'll go quietly. We won't resist arrest, but we're not leaving till we get Medicare for all, which is what I think there should be done, because it's a crime that people die because they don't have health insurance, especially in the middle of a pandemic. But now, as you're saying, because, you know, they deliberately let these, this, whatever you want to call it, alt-right out of the box. And I believe these people truly do exist, but I also believe that because I know that they do, but I also believe then they're pushed or, stirred up more by private intelligence, and it will be used as an excuse to it'll be Patriot Act 2.0, and it'll be used against, so anyone on the left can be targeted, because there's so many crazy things to pull out of this. First of all,
yeah,
if Black Lives Matter would have seized the Capitol like that, they would have been gunned down. I mean, it would have been a slaughter. There wouldn't be 6 people or 5 or whatever it is. It would have been mayhem. I mean, they would have just opened fire on them. They would have sent helicopters. I mean, it would have been nuts.
Well, they wouldn't have been let in, and they wouldn't have been allowed to get that close. And there wouldn't have been so few cops. I mean, you look at the videos, for example, of like the first Finch rushing before they even really get that close to the Capitol. There's like 3 cops there. Really? I mean, look at how militarized things like Occupy Wall Street war or the anti-Iraq war protest war, or, any meaningful protest movement that's come since. I mean, this was deliberate, and it was deliberate for a reason. And the fact that there's been no investigation of the DC police, and they still haven't issued an official report of what's going on. And instead of screaming about that, people in Congress are saying these people are insurrectionists and domestic terrorists and committed sedition, which is really dangerous, by the way, because that implies they're going to invoke the Sedition Act, which was used to target people, whistleblowers like Julian Assange and stuff like that, right? And is basically the sedition as defined is about advocating for the overthrow of the government, right? So if you're saying, we need to go sit in Congress peacefully, right? Or whatever. I mean, the government could argue, oh, you want to overthrow us, blah, blah, blah. Or if you're like the government, the CIA is the real government and that needs to stop. I mean, they can say that's sedition now and stuff like that. It's a very slippery slope, but why aren't the people in Congress demanding that the DC police people testify immediately? Where's their report? All of this stuff. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that doesn't make sense. Also, the fact that the DC police guy and the FBI both are putting or asking that regular people help identify the people that were at the Capitol for them. Like, they can't do it on their own with all their advanced surveillance technology, their advanced facial recognition technology. I mean, the FBI has technology where if you have your hand raised, on a picture on Twitter, Facebook, whatever, they can peel your fingerprints off of it and fingerprint you just because you have your hand raised. And so I'm supposed to believe that people with access to that need my help to say, oh, that's my friend from high school. That's this guy who's lives 3 doors down from me. To me, that's like conditioning that, we need to start ratting out our neighbors because they have opposing political views from us, which again is a very slippery slope. And I can tell you in CIA-backed dictatorships like there existed in Chile, I mean, people just would, didn't like their neighbor for some reason and would just call the police and be like, they're a communist when they weren't actually. And then you never see them again. I mean, yikes.
I mean, the thing that's scary is this playbook has been played before. Like you say, in Chile, they did this and anytime there's been some sort of fascist takeover, they use the far right in some way, shape, or form. Like even the Nazis used the brown shirts and then they turned on them. And then that's always some group that kind of gets propped up that does some of the violence, and then they say, oh, these people are bad, and now we need to take more rights away to keep you safe. It's really, I don't, yeah, the fact that I find it hard to believe that it's just, I mean, yes, that's the thing. There's not a lot, there's no either ors in this. There's a lot of both are trues, which are correct. There are absolute neo-Nazis within police departments, or at least police departments that are sympathetic to them. But
there are at the CIA too. You know what I mean? The CIA, after World War II, brought to the U.S. a bunch of Nazis, Operation Paperclip. President Truman signed off on that, and the people that have been running the CIA, unaccountable for decades, are basically Nazis, or were trained by Nazis and are their ideological successors. I mean, that's wild, right? So what they're doing now, in my opinion, is basically using the majority of Americans' extreme rejection of ethno-nationalism and ethno-fascism against us, when in reality, a lot of the people that are running the U.S. intelligence community and the national security state are themselves ethno-nationalists or racists. I mean, just look at Joe Biden, for example. This is the guy that's supposed to unite America, and he's the guy that eulogized the most racist person in Congress in the 20th century, Strom Thurmond, who did the longest filibuster in like congressional history at the time to prevent the Civil Rights Act from being passed. And Democrats boycotted his funeral, and Joe Biden's like, I'm going to give the guys a eulogy. He was great. You know, and the guy that passed the 94 crime bill and claimed to have written the first Patriot Act, and now he's here for Patriot Act 2.0, and he's going to fight the racists.
I know.
I mean, that's what we're supposed to believe, but that's the narrative that's being sold to us, and it's being promoted by people like the Squad and stuff like that. So I think we really need to step back. It's really easy to be emotional on times like this, but they want us to be emotional and not to think critically about this. And they want us to sign off and consent to policies that are going to be used to target people on the left and the right, and prevent us from creating any sort of meaningful change in our government. And so like now, for example, if there was to be a force the vote protest, like you were talking about earlier, where people go and say, we're not leaving till there's a vote on Medicare for all. Well, now after Wednesday, that will never happen. That can be called domestic terrorism now, based on what is coming from people that are supposed to be supporting Medicare for all and a lot of other policies. And sit-ins and federal buildings, for example, during the civil rights movement, was a key part of that, and was a big part of how that movement was able to affect real change. They want to criminalize that type of activity, and now they've done it. And now people on the left are being like, yeah, let's go farther. And not only that, let's take all the, increase tech censorship to huge degrees and empower Silicon Valley to huge degrees. When Silicon Valley not only came into existence largely with funding from the CIA's In-Q-Tel, but they've essentially merged with the military, and the people running the military's AI modernization policy and also the CIA's AI modernization policy are all Silicon Valley executives.
Oh, yeah. I mean,
it's insane. That's fascism. You want to call out fascism? Silicon Valley's fascist, but at the same time, a bunch of top DNC posts are also held by former bigwig Silicon Valley executives from Facebook, Amazon, Twitter, whatever.
Yeah, and they backed all these Democratic candidates, and you bring up great points. So people should really be clear here. So like when the Sunrise Movement sat outside Pelosi's office and wouldn't leave,
illegal now.
Yeah, that's
terrorism.
Illegal now. That's domestic terrorism. You pulled down a Confederate statue, you're a domestic terrorist. So I hope everybody understands that. You block a street for Black Lives Matter, you're a domestic terrorist now. Especially if you do any sort of government building, you are a domestic terrorist. So I hope everybody's real clear on what this means and what's going to happen. And I wish the American people would wake up and realize that they're actually in class warfare.
Absolutely. Thank you for saying that. The billionaire class has been pretty open about this. And you look at what happened last year. Who made all the money? I mean, the wealth of the billionaire class exploded last year. And what happened to the rest of us? Massive wealth transfer. And now people are understandably angry. Things are more unequal than ever. They know people are going to dissent. And look at the laws they're trying to pass and trying to get us to sign off on. We got to look at the big picture here and keep in mind who the real enemy is. Is the real enemy the person with the Trump lawn sign in their yard or the MAGA hat? Or is it the billionaire class that's trying to play us off against each other? We're pointing the finger at our neighbor, screaming, you're the terrorist, when really the people that are the terrorists are people like the CIA, the largest terrorist organization in the world. You know who are real domestic terrorists? is that should be in prison forever. Dick Cheney, pretty much everyone in the Bush administration. But no, Dick Cheney is going to be advising Biden on foreign policy now.
Jesus.
So what we have is the freaking uniparty trying to divide and conquer us with the oldest playbook in the book, and it is working. And the more they divide and conquer us, the more they are going to consolidate power and screw us all over in a way that we will never be able to dissent again or change things. And that's what they want. And so this is just arguably the most critical juncture in American history that we stand at right now. Right. And what we do from here on out is really going to determine the future of this country in a huge way. I really can't state that enough.
Yeah, it to me feels like it's too late. It feels like there's no real progressive leadership. Not even, I mean, obviously these people in the Democrat, Bernie and the squad, they're
fuck them.
They're fucking sellouts. They've done nothing.
But what they've done is tried to, we've been tried to be, they've tried to tell us that these people are like political saviors. And there's this mentality in the US on both sides that, as long as we vote the right people into power at the national level, have the right person sitting in the White House, then they're going to fix everything for us. Yeah. Progressives have always been focused on people-driven movements and people-driven change. It's time to realize that the power is with the people. You don't need a figurehead anymore. It's time to get local and get vocal and get active. But what they've done now, with COVID, restrictions on physically meeting, but now with the online censorship, they're restricting people being able to discuss, to organize, even online. So, I mean, our ruling class is scared of us. That's why they're doing this. And so I'm of the opinion that even if it seems like we've lost, we can't act like that. Do we want to be remembered as people that went down quietly, or people that were like, fuck you, Nazi CIA, until the very end? I mean, I'd rather be in the latter category personally. So, but I think the only solution to this is local. We can't go to DC and protest anymore.
Well,
we can't go to state capitals either, because they're militarizing those ahead of Inauguration Day.
Oh, yeah. Because there's like a credible threat. All 50 Capitol buildings are going to be attacked by Trump domestic terrorists. So now that's good. Everyone's they want everything up in smoke. I mean, the thing you really saw from the reaction of this, I had Lee Camp. We were talking about it on our podcast, Government Secrets. Is Lee Camp brought up a great point. He said, it's weird, people storming the Capitol building and doing that. Okay, there should be a fair amount of outrage to that. That's crazy. It's, it's dangerous. But how come 60,000 people dying a year because they don't have health insurance? How come the same amount of outrage by the corporate ruling class, the corporate media? We don't, all the other things that are as bad, if not way worse than because people are like, this is the worst thing ever. Last Wednesday was not the worst thing ever that's ever happened. And all of these things, and there's this sweeping outcry by the media and Congress, and everybody's going to do something about it. But it's really because the ruling class was threatened on Wednesday. You might not like the people that did it. You might not agree with them, but the people in power got threatened. Congress, I mean, I'm not happy there was people wearing Auschwitz stuff in the Capitol building, but the fact that a bunch of Congress and senators from both parties were running scared, I didn't have a problem with that. I'll be quiet. That didn't bother me at all. And I think people don't seem to, they're doing such a fantastic job of keeping us all divided. It's unbelievable. And even the so-called indie media, the so-called progressive media, the way they went after Jimmy, because he just wanted to give everybody help get health care. And
it tells you a lot.
Yeah.
It tells you a whole lot about where their priorities are and what they think matters. And I mean, just how easily, the divide and conquer playbook is the oldest one in the book. And we as a country are going to get so screwed over if we cannot collectively realize, like you said earlier, this is a class war. This is the elites versus everyone else. And those guys, the billionaires right now, they're playing for keeps.
Yes.
A lot of the surveillance technology and things they want to set up are designed so that people can never meaningfully dissent ever again. Our government has been beta testing this since the Vietnam War in the late 60s. And technology was a key part of that then, but technology's advanced a lot since the 60s. So think about the kind of stuff they can do. What they did in that original testing program for what this is, and the people that were involved in that, as I mentioned earlier, helped set up DHS. I mean, they killed like an estimated like 60,000 people. They just kidnapped and tortured and assassinated random people that they said were leftists, but it was a computer algorithm essentially that put a lot of people on those lists. Sound familiar? And basically the idea was to make everyone so afraid that they were going to be kidnapped in the middle of the night at any given time that everyone would just be extremely obedient to the government. That's wild. That's terrorism. That's the real terrorism.
Yeah, the real Nazis and terrorists are the CIA. Yeah. I mean, and the NSA for sure. I mean, and I hope people.
And we're funding them with tax money. It's time to stop paying taxes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Don't do it.
Yeah. It's, I mean, especially if you're behind on rent, which many Americans are. I mean, that's the other thing that's coming. They have to know that with this economic collapse that is looming, we haven't even begun the economic collapse that is coming as a result of COVID.
For sure.
All these bubbles that were there before COVID, housing bubble.
And no one in Congress wants to help you. They are all passing laws, and they did last year too, to just throw money to stuff that doesn't help regular Americans. It helps them and the people that fund them, right? Our political class does not serve the people. We need to stop acting like these political celebrities that like to march out in front of us are actually here to represent the people. Ilhan Omar's hero, from her own words, are people like Madeleine Albright and Margaret Thatcher. Are you kidding me? This is supposed to be like our progressive hero. Margaret Thatcher, I mean, I just can't even, I mean, you know, the female crazy, you know, Reagan equivalent prime minister of the UK. Like what?
And
that's a progressive icon.
That said it was okay that 500,000 Iraqi children were dead.
That's Madeleine Albright.
Yeah, that's another hero. Yeah, well, this is we are in interesting times, and I hope people wake up that it's class warfare. I really hope they wake up and unify that this is class warfare.
Well, you know what's interesting is that basically the left and the right, a lot of the stuff we're mad about, if you boil it down, is about this class warfare, but they've manipulated the narrative, largely thanks to people both in mainstream and independent even media, so much that it's become so distorted that we can't realize that we're actually agreeing about a lot of stuff. So, for example, how do you define, most people, well, I don't know how you define fascism personally, Graham, but a lot of people use, you know, the Mussolini era corporatism definition, where basically the corporations and the state merge, right? And so, you know, when we're talking about when I talk about fascism, you know, that's what I tend to think of. And, you know, there's other elements. There's usually like worship and glorification of the military, civil religion, and some other stuff that gets thrown in there, and sort of some other political ideologies can come in, right? But then you have people on the right screaming all day long about Marxism and communism, and how a lot of people, if you talk to them, they define that as when the state controls the business sector, right? So really, you know, when you boil it down, in the United States right now, we have the corporations, not just Silicon Valley, but corporations in general in the state have been merged arguably for a really long time. Yeah. So a lot of our grievances, when you boil it down to the root of it, on both sides are really similar. And look how much we are screaming at each other, when really what most people want is some sort of populist movement, whether from the left or the right, to separate the private and public sectors. It's crazy when you think about it.
Right. And they're still having some little dumb cat fight over this $2,000. We can't even get that. We can't even get $2,000, which is still not enough money if you're behind on rent 6 to 9 months. And
but we have money to make Space Force.
We got Space Force money. We got money for the $740 billion war budget. We always got money to bail out Wall Street, and we can't seem to figure out how to do anything that helps the people. And the propaganda machine has been so effective in keeping everybody divided, because like the right, when they say socialism, they don't even know what they're talking about. Socialism means workers own the means of production, and they think it means like Stalin. They don't even know what socialism means.
Well, that's what I mean. The narrative is so warped. If you actually talk to these people enough to get them to define what, you know, grinds their gears, you know, about, you know, the ideology they're railing against, it comes down to that. You know, it's tyranny when the state and business sectors are the same, and everything is controlled by the government, right? And so, but fascism too, look, when the corporations and the government merge, I mean, you're basically talking about a very similar power structure that the majority of Americans are against, right? So I think we can do a lot of good with dialogue, but it requires us not being so, being in the position that the government right now wants a lot of us to be in mentally and emotionally. And honestly, if there is any sort of like meaningful protest movement at some point in the future, I think at this point, it probably has to be bipartisan, because otherwise they'll paint it as Antifa terror or MAGA terror or whatever, if it's only one group and not the other one. I mean, what we really need is just a mass populist movement that's very clear about what the issues are. I mean, the unchecked corporate power of Silicon Valley is something progressives should oppose. And obviously conservatives oppose what Silicon Valley is doing right now. So why is there no movement to storm Silicon Valley, for example? Right? Or, why, if the enemy of QAnon's the deep state, why aren't they storming Langley, Virginia, the CIA headquarters? I mean,
well, everybody,
I'd love to see that personally.
Yeah, I would love to see that. I'd love to see a siege of Langley, Virginia, the CIA building, and the NSA, or somebody just overtakes their servers and takes them offline. That would be amazing to watch. Folks, you're watching The Political Vigilante. Please hit the like button. If you're new to the show, please subscribe. YouTube has been unsubscribing us at an alarming rate. Thanks for watching, everybody. Please hit the like button, the subscribe button. Go to patreon.com/Graham Elwood and rockfin.com/Graham Elwood, where you can support the show. Also, I have a Bitcoin wallet, a Bitcoin Cash wallet, and an Ethereum wallet in the show notes. We're taking cryptocurrency. I have a Coinbase affiliation link. We're going to be getting on some other exchanges. So that's how you support the show. Make sure you hit the subscribe button. YouTube is unsubscribing us at an alarming rate. I have a PayPal button at GrahamElwood.com. I even have a Venmo at Graham-Elwood. There's a lot of ways to support our show. We are getting crushed by YouTube. We've dipped under 73,000 subscribers because of YouTube. Thanks for supporting what we do.